If there's one thing you may have noticed on this channel over the years, it's that we're a big fan of the 3D action platformer. And I'm here to show you a recent addition to that genre in Effie, released in early June of this year. Developed by Spanish developer Inverge, the story in Effie sees you play as a character called Galland, who is cursed by the evil witch Melira and turned into an old man. This has absolutely no bearing on the gameplay, however, as Galland is just as agile and capable as your typical platforming hero, but of course you must reverse the spell for some reason by collecting the 4 gems of evil spread across the land. So yeah, so far so goes your typical platforming quest of collecting the MacGuffins and stopping the evil being from doing whatever they were doing. It's generic and dumb, yeah, but thankfully after the brief introduction, the plot is never intrusive to the gameplay and doesn't come back until the climax of the game, as it should be, because the voice acting is, it's pretty bad.
It was an ambush. Melira was summoning her demonic minions with a devilish cackle.
As for the gameplay itself, well, it's actually pretty fun. It doesn't do anything groundbreaking or original. You have a jump, a double jump, and eventually you acquire a small dash, so the platforming, while simple, feels really good. It has a nice weight to the jumping, sort of similar to Banjo, but with the smooth ledge grabbing of, say, Rayman. It isn't all just platforming though, as there's a fair amount of combat in Effie, and like a lot of the early to mid 2000s platformers that inspired it, is pretty rigid and can become really repetitive. Well, at least at first, because the combat is really bad on first impressions, as it's just one light and heavy attack with a simple 3-hit combo, which gets old fast. Luckily though, Effie doles out upgrades in the form of extra moves that can take down hordes of enemies and larger creatures in a quicker time, from doing a sort of ground pound with a blast radius to a spinning boomerang type move. They all feel great to pull off when you finally get these upgrades, but they just make the already easy combat all the more easy. Not to mention that you're constantly collecting these little rooms scattered all over the game which fill up this meter in the top left, leveling you up and permanently increasing your strength for fighting the monsters. So yeah, whilst the combat gets less monotonous the further you progress, it in turn gets progressively easier. In fact, I never actually died to any of the enemies throughout my entire 5-hour playthrough. Where I did die was to the many cheap death pits and death traps, which is fine. I don't mind dying to some tricky platforming every now and then, but it's not exactly helped by the long load times between each death. Plus, you hear the same voice over from Galland every time you die.
That's not what happened. Oh, that's not what happened. Oh, that's not what happened. Oh, Galland was aging, but he could still become a hero. Oh, Galland was aging, but he could still become a hero. Oh, Galland was aging, but he could still become a hero. Oh, that's not what happened.
For context, the whole game is told as a storybook by Galland to this little girl called Effie, hence the title's name. I probably should have put this in the story section of this review, but sod it, I'll leave it here. As mentioned earlier, you're tasked with collecting these 4 gems of evil, which basically means you have 4 separate worlds to explore, culminating in a fight with the witch Melira in each land. There's the bright windmills town, the creepy looking Woodbourne, which I assume is a reference to Bloodborne, it even looks like it, the colourful vineyards, and the final area, the Temple of Oblina. Each area has a distinct feel and unique look to it, so it's not just your typical grass, desert or lava lands, definitely giving Effie some of its own identity. So yeah, 4 main areas may seem like a little on the short side, and it kind of is, but they're all connected by one giant open field area, which is probably Effie's greatest aspect, and that's purely because you traverse it by zipping along on your shield like a damn hoverboard. It reminds me of the hoverboard sections in Jak 2, but with the speed cranked up to 11 and having none of the annoying cops on your case. Hitting these beams of light everywhere gives you a boost, with consecutive hits increasing your speed so much so that you'll start making Sonic the Hedgehog jealous. The open world itself isn't completely barren either, as you'll find little enemy outposts and tall structures, with puzzles to solve and treasure to collect. Honestly, I got some major Zelda vibes from exploring this entire open field. These are by no means necessary to progress, but are just a nice reward for players who like to explore and take part in side quests, like this neat little time trial gate race. Unfortunately, you can only use your hoverboard shield thingy in the overworld, as the main areas restrict you to just walk in every other part of the game, which is a shame, as it made the entire experience feel rather disjointed. Don't get me wrong, I love riding the hover shield, but I just wish it had also been implemented elsewhere.
A discreet place. Except for installed chimneys.
As you can probably tell, the game looks really nice and has a really striking art style, especially the red plains of the overworld, but I'll admit that some of the interior areas can look a little generic, almost like it was created in Media Molecule's Dreams game. The animations are alright, Galland himself looks great, but during the cutscenes he can look laughably stiff. Performance wise it runs fine on my regular PS4, well about 80% of the time. There's some slowdown here and there, most notably when too many enemies are on screen, which didn't happen all too often, but the game did crash the PS4 home screen once during my initial playthrough, and it did yet again and also froze during my second playthrough when recording footage for this review. Maybe this has been fixed since I last played it, but the game has a very frequent autosave, so the crashing was nothing more than a minor inconvenience for me. But probably my biggest complaint with the whole game is really only relevant to anyone who's a bit of a completionist, as not only does this game not feature multiple save files, but once you defeat the boss of each area, that's it, you can't go back to that world and it's completely gated off, whether you've collected everything there or not. Worse still is that when you get to the final area, you're warned of a point of no return, which is fine, obviously a lot of games do this, but at that point everywhere else is locked off anyway, so it really doesn't matter about not going back. Don't worry, I'm not going to spoil the end section of the game, but once you do beat the final boss and roll the credits, then reload the game, it puts you right back to the start of the boss fight, which is way after the point of no return. If you want to re-explore the game again, you have to completely wipe your save file and start all over. No New Game Plus, and no, none of your upgrades or collectibles carry over. Basically, if you want that shiny platinum trophy, make sure you use a guide as not to miss any collectibles.
Galen felt an urge within him. Oh, Galen had found a relic.
In summary, Effie is a beautifully charming action-adventure platformer that is a lot of fun to play. It certainly isn't without its faults, and has a fair amount of missed potential, but if this seemed at all interesting to you, and if you're a fan of this type of game, then I wouldn't discourage giving it a look. It's currently £16 on the UK PlayStation Store and $20 on the US one, with only a Steam release coming later this year. Unfortunately, so far there's no word on the other platforms like Xbox and Switch, but you never know. Like Galen himself, Effie is somewhat on the short side and old in design, but it's still young at heart and has enough unique aspects to stand out from the crowd.